The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Thomas Whitmore arrived in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory in late October 1892. The streets were rivers of mud that swallowed wagon wheels whole, and the buildings stood like rotting teeth against a sky the color of old bruises. He had traveled from Boston, sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate irregularities in the financial reports of Hawthorne Academy, a government-funded boarding school for native children located 30 miles north of the territorial capital. Thomas was not a man prone to sentiment. At 42, he had spent 2 decades reviewing ledgers, cross-referencing expenditures, and exposing embezzlement with the cold precision of a surgeon excising diseased tissue. He had seen corruption in orphanages, in hospitals, in military contracts. Numbers did not lie, and numbers were what he trusted. But as his hired coach lurched through the October darkness toward Hawthorne Academy, something in the Oklahoma night pressed against him with a weight that transcended arithmetic. The academy sat on a plateau overlooking the Canadian River, a 3-story brick structure that had once been a Confederate fortification during the war. The windows were narrow and deep-set, like suspicious eyes. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, its gates hanging open on rusted hinges. Thomas noticed immediately that the grounds were immaculately maintained, despite the rain. Not a weed grew between the stones of the courtyard. The flower beds were precise, geometric patterns, though nothing bloomed this late in the season. Headmaster Edmund Carver met him at the entrance. He was a tall man, spare as winter wheat, with pale eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond Thomas's shoulder when they shook hands. His grip was dry and firm, his smile a practiced arrangement of lips and teeth. "Mr. Whitmore, we received your telegram. Please come in from this dreadful weather." Carver's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried through the stone hallways with peculiar clarity. The interior of Hawthorne Academy was spotless. The floors shone with recent polishing. The walls were bare, except for portraits of stern-faced men in military uniforms and government officials. Thomas caught no sound of children, though his papers indicated the school housed 147 students between the ages of 6 and 16. "The children are at evening study," Carver explained, as if reading his thoughts. "We maintain strict schedules here, Mr. Whitmore. Structure is essential for civilization." Thomas was shown to a small office on the 2nd floor where he would conduct his audit. The room smelled of linseed oil and something else, something faintly mineral that he could not identify. A single window overlooked the courtyard, and beyond it, the river valley shrouded in rain and gathering darkness. "I'll have the financial records brought to you in the morning," Carver said. "For now, please join me for dinner. I'm sure you're exhausted from your journey." The dining room was in the basement level, a long chamber with stone walls that wept moisture, despite the fire burning in the massive hearth. Carver ate little, pushing food around his plate while asking polite questions about Thomas's journey, about conditions in Boston, about the territorial government's view of native education. Thomas answered mechanically, his attention drawn to a sound that seemed to come from somewhere below them. A rhythmic tapping, like water dripping into water, slow and measured. "The cisterns," Carver said, noticing his distraction. "The building has an extensive system of water storage. Quite remarkable engineering, really. The Confederates designed it to withstand sieges." That night, Thomas lay in the guest quarters listening to rain and creaking wood. Sleep would not come. The silence was oppressive. Somewhere past midnight he heard singing, a child's voice, thin and tremulous, in an unknown language. He followed it down through the building to the basement dining room. The room was empty, but the singing continued from behind the stone hearth. He found a hidden gap, pressed, and a section of wall swung inward. Stone steps descended into darkness. The singing stopped. Thomas descended. The stairwell ended in a tunnel carved through limestone. The air was cold, thick with the smell of minerals and rot. Thomas marked his path by scraping arrows into the soft stone with his penknife. The tunnel branched repeatedly, forming a labyrinth beneath the academy. The tunnel opened into a chamber. His lamp revealed what had once been a cistern, a circular room perhaps 40 feet across with a vaulted ceiling, but the cistern was not empty. It was filled nearly to the brim with dark water, perfectly still, reflecting his lamplight like black glass. Around the perimeter of the room, carved into the stone wall at intervals of 3 feet, were names, hundreds of names, some in English, some in what he recognized as Cherokee syllabary, others in scripts he could not identify. Thomas approached the water's edge. The surface was motionless. He knelt and saw his reflection, then other faces, child faces suspended below, eyes open, mouths open, hands reaching upward. He jerked back, the lamp nearly falling from his hand. When he looked again, there was only his own reflection, distorted and pale. But he had seen them. He was certain he had seen them. A sound behind him made him spin around. Headmaster Carver stood at the tunnel entrance, still dressed in his evening clothes, a lamp in his own hand. His pale eyes reflected the light like an animal's. "I wondered if you would find this place," Carver said softly. "Men like you always do. Men who believe in truth, in justice, in the revelation of hidden things." "What is this?" Thomas's voice was steady despite the ice in his veins. "This is education, Mr. Whitmore. This is the work of civilizing the savage. Do you know how many languages are spoken in this territory? Dozens. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and more. Each one a barrier to progress, to assimilation, to the American dream. We are charged with removing those barriers. By drowning children." The words came out as a whisper. "By removing the old language, the old ways. We tried other methods first, punishment, isolation, beatings, but the truly stubborn ones, the ones who refused to abandon their mother tongues even after months of correction, they required more permanent lessons. They would not be silent, Mr. Whitmore, so we helped them understand silence." Carver moved closer, his lamp casting his shadow enormous against the curved wall. "Do you know what happens when you hold a child underwater? At first, they fight. Such remarkable strength, really, in such small bodies. They thrash and kick, and their eyes go wide with terror. But if you hold them long enough, just to the edge of drowning, then pull them back, then push them under again, eventually something breaks. Not their bodies, their spirits. They learn that language, the language of their mothers and grandmothers, is the thing that brings them to the water. They learn that silence is survival." "You're describing torture, murder." "I'm describing pedagogy, Mr. Whitmore, and you'll note that our graduation rates are exemplary. The students who leave Hawthorne Academy are model citizens, silent, obedient, industrious. They understand that to be American, one must sound American. The price of freedom is conformity." Thomas's hand moved slowly toward the pistol in his coat pocket. He had brought it for bandits on the road, never imagining he would need it here, but Carver saw the movement and smiled. "You're wondering if you can kill me and escape. Let me save you the trouble of uncertainty. You cannot." Carver raised his lamp higher, and Thomas saw that they were not alone. Figures emerged from the tunnel shadows. Not adults, but adolescents, boys and girls in the academy's grey uniforms, their faces blank, their movements synchronized. They formed a semicircle around him. "Cutting off, escape." "These are my senior students," Carver said. "They understand what you do not, that freedom is an illusion, that we are all servants of larger forces. They have been baptized in these waters, Mr. Whitmore. They have learned the lesson of silence, and now so will you." The students moved forward as one, their hands reaching for him. Thomas pulled the pistol and fired. The shot was deafening in the stone chamber, the muzzle flash blinding. He heard the bullet ricochet off stone, heard nothing else. When his vision cleared, the students had not stopped. One of them had a dark stain spreading across their grey uniform, but they showed no sign of pain, no acknowledgement of the wound. They kept coming. Thomas ran. He plunged past them into the tunnel, his lamp forgotten, running blind through the darkness, with only the memory of the arrows he had scratched into the walls to guide him. Behind him came the sound of footsteps, perfectly synchronized, neither hurrying nor slowing. They did not chase him. They herded him, driving him deeper into the labyrinth when he turned the wrong way, allowing him forward when he chose the path back to the stairs. He burst through the hidden door into the dining room, scrambled up the basement stairs, and ran through the dark corridors of the academy toward the main entrance. The front doors were locked, bolted from the outside. He threw his weight against them, accomplishing nothing. The footsteps continued behind him, unhurried, inevitable. Thomas ran up the stairs to the second floor, to the third, looking for another way out, a window, anything. But every door he tried was locked, every window barred. The building had become a prison, and he was its newest inmate. Finally, gasping, he retreated to his assigned room and barricaded the door with furniture. He stood at the window, looking down at the courtyard 30 feet below. The rain had stopped. The moon emerged from behind tattered clouds, illuminating the geometric precision of the flower beds, the empty courtyard, and something else. In the courtyard, arranged in perfect rows, stood dozens of children. They stood motionless in their grey uniforms, their faces turned upward toward his window. They did not move, they did not speak, they simply watched. Thomas backed away from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed help, he needed witnesses, he needed the authorities to know what was happening here. He fumbled for his travelling case, found paper and pen, and began to write by the light of his guttering candle. He wrote everything he had seen, everything Carver had said, the names carved in the cistern walls, the faces in the water. His hand shook, but the words came clear, driven by the desperate certainty that this might be his only chance to bear witness. A soft knock came at the door. "Mr. Whitmore?" Carver's voice was gentle, patient. "There's no need for this drama. Open the door. We can discuss this like civilized men." Thomas kept writing. He detailed the location of the hidden door, the tunnel system, the cistern. He addressed the letter to the territorial marshal in Guthrie, sealed it with wax from the candle, and looked for a way to get it out. The window. He could throw it from the window, hope it landed where someone might find it, someone who was not part of this nightmare. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to ask the students to open the door now. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Thomas heard the sound of many hands against the wood, heard the barricade beginning to shift. He threw open the window and hurled the letter as far as he could into the night. He watched it arc through the moonlight and disappear into the darkness beyond the courtyard. Then he turned back to face the door as it burst open. The students flooded in, silent and synchronized, their hands cold and damp when they gripped his arms, his legs, his throat. They lifted him as if he weighed nothing and carried him down the stairs, through the corridors, to the basement, through the hidden door, down into the tunnels. Carver walked ahead with a lamp, humming softly to himself. "You'll understand soon," Carver said as they carried Thomas into the cistern chamber. "The water teaches everyone, eventually. It taught the Confederate soldiers who built this place, thinking they could preserve their way of life through violence and stone walls. It taught the children who spoke their ancestral languages, thinking words could preserve cultures already dying. And it will teach you, Mr. Whitmore, that truth and justice and all those noble concepts you serve are merely sounds we make before the silence claims us all." They brought him to the edge of the dark water. Thomas struggled, but the hands that held him were too many, too strong. Carver knelt beside him and spoke directly into his ear. Do you know what freedom really is, Mr. Whitmore? It's not the ability to speak. It's the ability to choose silence, to understand that some truths are too heavy to carry, some words too dangerous to speak. The children who graduate from Hawthorne Academy are free, free from the burden of their past, free from languages that mark them as other, free from the weight of memory, and you will be free too. The water was cold beyond cold when they pushed him under. It filled his nose, his mouth, his lungs with liquid ice. He thrashed and fought, and through the dark water he saw faces. The children, their eyes open and accusing, their hands reaching for him, not in threat, but in welcome, inviting him to join them in the silence below. He broke the surface, gasped air, and was pushed under again. Up and down, drowning and breathing, until he could no longer tell which was which, until his lungs burned and his vision darkened, and everything became distant and soft. When he woke, he was lying on the stone floor of the cistern chamber, vomiting water, his body convulsing with cold. Carver stood over him, watching with clinical interest. "How many languages do you speak, Mr. Whitmore?" "One," Thomas managed through chattering teeth. "And what is that language?" "English." "Very good. And will you speak it again, here in this place?" Thomas looked up at him, at the students standing in their semicircle, at the dark water behind them, and understood the choice he was being given. He could speak and be returned to the water, again and again, until he broke. Or he could be silent and perhaps live. "No," he whispered. "Excellent. You're learning. Take him to the dormitory. He'll work with the junior students tomorrow. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have most recently learned the lesson themselves." They took him up from the cisterns, through the tunnels, back into the academy proper. They gave him a grey uniform, identical to theirs, and showed him to a narrow bed in a long room lined with narrow beds. 70 children slept there, or pretended to sleep, their breathing synchronized, their bodies still. Thomas lay down among them, his clothes still damp from the cistern, and stared at the ceiling. He tried to remember why he had come to Hawthorne Academy, something about numbers, about ledgers and expenditures. But the specifics eluded him, washed away in the dark water, and when he reached for them, his thoughts slipped like fish through his fingers. He knew his name. He knew he had been someone important once, someone who traveled and investigated and wrote reports. But that person seemed very far away now, on the other side of a cold and silent drowning. In the morning, Carver came to collect him. The headmaster looked refreshed, his pale eyes bright with satisfaction. "Come, Mr. Whitmore. I want to show you how the academy operates. After all, you'll be staying with us for some time." Thomas followed silently. They walked through classrooms where children sat in perfect rows, their hands folded on desks, their lips sealed. Teachers moved among them, speaking only English, asking questions that required only nods or shakes of the head. Thomas saw a girl, perhaps 10 years old, her lips moving soundlessly in what might have been prayer, or might have been a song in a language she no longer dared to voice. When the teacher noticed, the girl's eyes went wide with fear, and she pressed her hands over her mouth. "She's still learning," Carver said softly, "but she'll understand soon enough. They all do." They descended again to the basement level, but this time Carver led him past the dining room to another door, another stairwell. This one went down even deeper, into tunnels that predated the academy, that perhaps predated the Confederate fortification, carved by hands unknown for purposes lost to time. The walls here were different, marked with symbols that were neither English nor any native script Thomas recognized. They were older, stranger, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Do you know the history of this land, Mr. Whitmore? Before the territory, before the Indian removal, before the Europeans, people lived here. They built cities and roads and temples, and then they vanished. Anthropologists have theories, of course, drought, disease, warfare, but I know the truth. I found it written in these walls. They learned the same lesson we teach at Hawthorne Academy. They learned that language is power, and power is dangerous. They learned that silence is survival. And when they had all fallen silent, there was nothing left to distinguish them from the stones and the earth. They became the land itself, wordless and eternal. Carver stopped at another cistern, smaller than the first, its water clearer. "This is the original," he said, "the one they used. The water here is special. It doesn't just fill the lungs, it fills the mind. It washes away the old words, the old thoughts, and leaves only silence behind. That's why Hawthorne Academy was built here, on this specific spot. That's why it works when other schools fail. The water teaches what we cannot." Thomas stared into the clear water and saw his reflection staring back. But his reflection was wrong. Its mouth was moving, forming words he could not hear, speaking with desperate urgency in a language he had never learned. His reflection was drowning, and he was the one above water, watching it happen, powerless to help. "What am I?" Thomas heard himself ask. "You're a student now. One of many who have come to Hawthorne Academy thinking to expose its secrets, only to become part of them. Don't worry, it's not unpleasant once you accept it. You'll teach the children. You'll help them understand the necessity of silence, and in time you'll forget there was ever any other way to be." Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Time moved strangely in Hawthorne Academy, measured not by clocks but by lessons and meals, and the slow transformation of the students who arrived still speaking their mother tongues. Thomas watched them arrive in wagons, crying and confused, ripped from their families by government mandate. He watched them resist, saw the fire in their eyes when teachers punished them for speaking Choctaw or Cherokee or Creek. And he watched them taken down to the cisterns, one by one, until the fire went out and only silence remained. He tried to remember why this was wrong. Some part of him, some distant voice, insisted that children should not be tortured, that language was not a crime, that this entire institution was an abomination. But that voice grew fainter each day, drowned out by the teachings of the water and the weight of Carver's pale eyes. He found himself leading children to the cisterns, holding them under while they thrashed and choked, pulling them up and asking, "Will you be silent?" and pushing them under again when they gasped out words in their forbidden languages. One evening, after a particularly resistant boy had finally broken and been sent back to the dormitory, Thomas found himself alone in the largest cistern chamber. He stared into the dark water, trying to remember his own name, his own purpose. The faces below the surface stared back at him, and this time he recognized one of them. It was the boy from that evening, eyes open, mouth open, hands reaching upward. But the boy was upstairs in the dormitory. Thomas had personally escorted him there. This face in the water was something else, a memory of drowning, a ghost of the self that had been killed to make the silent, obedient self that remained. "We all have one down there," a Carver's voice came from behind him. "The person we were before we understood. You can see yours if you look closely enough." Thomas looked. In the deepest part of the water, beneath the faces of the children, he saw a man in a suit, a man with papers and ledgers and righteous anger, a man who believed in truth and justice and the revelation of hidden things. That man was screaming, his mouth open wide, bubbles rising from his throat. That man was drowning, had been drowning for days or weeks or months, would drown forever in the dark water beneath Hawthorne Academy. "Is he still alive?" Thomas asked. "In a sense, the water preserves. That's why the children who die here never decay. They remain suspended, teaching future students the cost of resistance. You see, Mr. Whitmore, Hawthorne Academy isn't just about removing languages. It's about removing the illusion of self, the belief that we are individuals with rights and freedoms and voices that matter. We are teaching the children what America truly demands. Not just English words, but American silence. The understanding that we are all expendable, all replaceable, all drowning in waters we cannot see. Thomas looked away from the cistern, looked at Carver, and asked the question that had been forming in his mind for days. "How long have you been here?" Carver smiled. "I don't remember. There was a headmaster before me, or perhaps I've always been here. The academy has stood for 30 years, but the cisterns are older, much older. Sometimes I think the building grew around them, drawn by their gravity the way cities grow around rivers. Does it matter? I teach the children. The children grow silent. The cycle continues. And when I forget who I was completely, when there's nothing left of Thomas Whitmore, then you'll be free, truly free. Free from memory, from guilt, from the burden of witnessing. You'll be like the children who graduate from here, empty vessels that can be filled with whatever America demands. That night, Thomas dreamed of drowning. He dreamed of water filling his lungs, of voices crying out in languages he could not understand, of hands pulling him down into darkness that had no bottom. He woke gasping and found children standing around his bed. Their eyes were open but unseeing, their mouths moving soundlessly. They were sleepwalking or something like it, drawn by some communal nightmare to stand and watch the adults who had brought them to the water. Thomas rose from his bed and walked among them. They did not react to his presence. He realized he was seeing the true cost of Hawthorne Academy's education. These children were not sleeping. They were trapped in permanent drowning. Their minds submerged even when their bodies walked and ate and obeyed. They had been so thoroughly silenced that silence had become their only state of being. He walked out of the dormitory and through the dark halls of the academy. He walked without thinking, his feet carrying him to the office where he had been meant to conduct his audit. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust covered the desk and chairs. No one had been in this room for a long time. He found his traveling case in a corner, unopened, covered in cobwebs. When he opened it, papers spilled out. Reports, notes, letters of introduction from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Thomas picked up one of the letters and tried to read it. The words swam before his eyes, meaningless shapes on paper. He had forgotten how to read, or perhaps he had never known. He could not remember. He put the letter down and looked at his hands. They were pale and thin, the hands of someone who had been underground for a long time. His reflection in the darkened window showed a stranger, gaunt, hollow-eyed, dressed in a grey uniform identical to the students'. How long had he been here? He heard footsteps in the corridor and knew without looking that it was Carver. The headmaster entered the office carrying a lamp, unsurprised to find Thomas there. "You wrote a letter," Carver said. "The night you discovered the cisterns. You threw it from your window. Do you remember?" Thomas tried to remember. Fragments came back to him. Desperate writing by candlelight. The arc of something white disappearing into darkness. "Yes." "Would you like to know what happened to it?" Carver reached into his coat and produced an envelope sealed with red wax. The seal was unbroken. "It landed in the courtyard. One of the students found it in the morning and brought it to me. I've kept it all this time, waiting for you to ask about it. Would you like to read it?" Thomas took the envelope with shaking hands. His name was written on it in handwriting he almost recognized. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. But he could not read it. The words were English. He knew that much. But they conveyed no meaning. They were just shapes, dead symbols on dead paper. "You wrote about truth," Carver said softly. "About justice and exposure, and the revelation of hidden things. You documented everything you saw. You called for authorities to investigate, for the academy to be shut down, for me to be arrested. You believed that words could change the world." "Can't they?" Thomas asked. "Words are just sounds we make before the silence claims us. You know that now. You've learned it the same way everyone learns it, by drowning." Thomas looked at the letter again, trying to force meaning from the marks on the page. One phrase resolved itself slowly, painfully. "The children deserve freedom." He had written that. Thomas Whitmore, auditor from Boston, man of truth and justice, had written those words. But Thomas could not remember what freedom meant, or why children deserved it, or why he had cared enough to risk everything to say so. "I want to remember," Thomas said. "No, you don't. Memory is suffering. You're much happier now, teaching the children, helping them find silence. Why would you want to return to the pain of witness?" "Because—" Thomas struggled to articulate something that felt important, essential, but kept slipping away. "Because someone has to remember, someone has to tell what happened here." Carver's smile faded. "No one has to do anything, Mr. Whitmore. That's the final lesson. We are not heroes or villains. We are not even people, really. We are functions of a system designed to erase difference, to create uniformity, to drown out every voice except the one approved voice. You cannot fight that system. You can only be consumed by it or become its instrument. You chose instrument. You made the wise choice. I choose to remember. Then you choose to drown again." The students came for him in the morning. They took him down to the cisterns, back to the dark water, and this time they held him under for a long time, long enough for his lungs to burn, for his vision to fade, for the world to become distant and cold. When they pulled him up, Carver was there, asking his questions. "Will you be silent about what you've seen?" Thomas gasped for air, coughed water, and managed one word. "No." They pushed him under again. And again, and again. Days passed this way, or weeks, measured only in drowning and breathing, drowning and breathing. Each time they asked, each time he refused, until his body was weak and his mind scattered, and he could no longer remember why resistance mattered. But some stubborn core of self, some fragment of the man who had believed in truth and justice, refused to break completely. Finally, Carver changed his approach. They brought Thomas to the smallest cistern, the one with clear water, and left him there alone. "Stay as long as you need," Carver said. "Look into the water. Understand what you are." Thomas knelt at the water's edge and looked. His reflection stared back. But behind it, beneath it, he saw the other Thomas, the one who was still drowning, still screaming, still trying to speak truths that no one would hear. And below that Thomas, he saw others, children, dozens of them, hundreds of them, suspended in the clear water, their mouths open in silent cries. And below them, older shapes, adults in uniforms from wars past. And below them, ancient figures with unfamiliar faces, dressed in clothes that predated history. All of them drowning, all of them silent, all of them preserved in the water that washed away language and memory and self. "We're all here," Thomas whispered to his reflection. "Everyone who tried to speak, everyone who resisted, all of us drowning together." His reflection's mouth moved, forming words in languages Thomas had never learned, in scripts that predated writing itself. And slowly, painfully, Thomas began to understand. The water did not just teach silence, it preserved the voices it stole. Every language spoken at Hawthorne Academy, every forbidden word, every prayer and song and story, they were all here, trapped in the water, drowning eternally but never quite dying. The cisterns were not just instruments of torture. They were archives of erasure, repositories of every culture the Academy had tried to destroy. Thomas reached into the water. His fingers touched the surface and kept going, passing through as if through air. The cold enveloped his arm, his shoulder, and he leaned forward, falling into the clear water that was not water, but something else, something older than water. He fell past his drowning self, past the drowning children, past the soldiers and the ancient figures. down and down into a darkness that had no bottom, but had depth beyond measure. He fell through the history of silencing, through broken treaties and forced removals, through residential schools and cultural genocide, through every attempt to erase difference and enforce conformity. He saw Hawthorne Academy as just one link in a chain that stretched back to the beginning of contact. Forward to futures he could barely comprehend. He saw other schools, other systems, other children drowning in other waters. He saw the pattern, the system, the machine designed to break spirits and silence voices and create uniform, obedient, forgetting citizens. And he understood that he could not stop it. One man could not break a system so vast, so deeply embedded in the structure of the nation itself. But one man could remember, one man could preserve what the water preserved, could carry witness even if that witness could never be delivered. When Thomas surfaced, he was lying on the stone floor of the cistern chamber again, coughing and gasping, but something had changed. The water had not broken him. It had shown him something deeper, something Carver had not intended him to see. The headmaster stood over him, and for the first time, Thomas saw uncertainty in those pale eyes. "What did you see?" Carver asked. "Everything," Thomas whispered. "I saw all of them, every child you drowned, every voice you silenced. They're still there, speaking in the water. You didn't erase them, you just imprisoned them." Carver's face went white. "That's impossible. The water teaches silence. It breaks the will to speak. It doesn't preserve." "You're wrong. The water is a prison, not an executioner. Every language you tried to kill is down there, trapped but alive, drowning but still speaking. This place isn't a school, it's a tomb, and you're its keeper." For a long moment, Carver said nothing. Then he knelt beside Thomas and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "If that's true, if they're all still there, still speaking, then I've accomplished nothing. 30 years of work, hundreds of children, thousands of lessons, and the languages survive, the cultures survive. I've built nothing but a monument to my own failure." "Not failure," Thomas said, finding strength in the realization. "Witness. You've created a record of every crime committed in the name of civilization. Every atrocity is preserved here, documented in water and stone. You can't destroy it now, even if you wanted to. The evidence exists." Carver stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the cistern. He stared into the dark water for a long time. "Then what am I? What have I been doing all these years? What you were taught to do, what the system demanded. You're as much a prisoner as the children, Carver. The difference is, you had a choice." The headmaster turned back to Thomas, and for the first time, he looked old. Not just aged, but ancient, as if decades of cruelty had suddenly caught up with him all at once. "I had a choice," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose I did." He looked at the students standing in their silent semicircle around the chamber. "Take Mr. Whitmore back to the dormitory. I need to think." They carried Thomas up through the tunnels and back to his bed. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the synchronized breathing of the children around him. He had seen something in the water that Carver had not. He had seen that silence could be broken, that what had been drowned could be raised again. But he did not know how. He was one man, weakened by days of drowning, trapped in an institution that existed to erase truth. That night, the dreams came again. But this time, they were different. Instead of drowning, Thomas found himself standing in a vast underground space filled with the clear water. And in the water, children swam, alive and laughing, speaking in languages that made the water shimmer with color. They called to him, not in English, but in Choctaw and Cherokee and Creek, and languages he could not name. And though he did not understand the words, he understood their meaning. "Tell our story. Remember us. Do not let them say we were silent." He woke with a start. finding children standing around his bed again. But this time their eyes were focused. They were looking at him with desperate intensity, their lips moving soundlessly. They were trying to speak, trying to break through whatever hold the water had over them. Thomas sat up slowly, and one of the children, a girl perhaps 12 years old, reached out and touched his hand. Her touch was cold and damp, but her eyes were alive with urgency. She pointed to her mouth, then to her throat, then to the floor. Down. The cisterns. She wanted him to understand something about the cisterns. Thomas nodded and she withdrew, the other children following her back to their beds like shadows melting into darkness. The next morning, Carver did not come for Thomas. The senior students who usually supervised the daily routines seemed confused, directionless. Whispers circulated through the academy, the first actual words Thomas had heard spoken by students since his arrival. Carver had not left his office. Carver had not given any orders. Carver was not responding to knocks on his door. Thomas used the confusion to explore. He walked through the classrooms, seeing them with new eyes. The perfect rows of desks, the bare walls, the teachers speaking in monotones about grammar and arithmetic, everything designed to strip away identity, to replace the complex, beautiful cultures of the students with a homogeneous American blankness. But he also saw resistance. A boy carving symbols into his desk with his fingernail. A girl humming almost inaudibly, a melody that predated this nation. Small acts of defiance, carefully hidden from the teachers, preserved in secret. He made his way to the basement, to the hidden door behind the hearth. It stood open, which was unusual. Thomas descended into the tunnels, following the path he now knew by heart, down to the largest cistern. What he found there stopped him cold. Carver stood at the edge of the water, his back to Thomas. He was speaking, but not in English. The words were fluid and musical, a language Thomas did not recognize. As Carver spoke, the water began to move. Ripples spread across its surface, then waves, then a churning that made the entire chamber shake. Something was rising from the depths. Carver. Thomas shouted over the sound of rushing water. The headmaster turned. His face was streaked with tears. "I remember," he said. "I remember my name, my real name. Before they brought me to a school like this one, before they drowned the language out of me, before I became what they made me, I remember." The water erupted, not with violence but with release. Shapes rose from the depths, dozens of them, hundreds of them. The children who had drowned, but not dead. Not exactly, they were pale and translucent. More water than flesh, but they were moving, speaking, singing in their mother tongues. The chamber filled with the sound of languages Hawthorne Academy had tried to kill, and the sound was deafening, overwhelming, beautiful. Thomas fell to his knees, his hands over his ears, not from pain, but from the sheer immensity of it. These were the voices the water had preserved, rising now because Carver had spoken his true name, had broken the silence that sustained the drowning. The children flowed past him like a river, up through the tunnels, spreading through the academy above. "What have you done?" Thomas asked when he could speak again. "What I should have done 30 years ago. I've set them free, or as free as they can be. They're not alive, Mr. Whitmore. They died here, drowned by my hands and the hands of teachers before me. But their voices, their languages, their memories, those were trapped in the water. Now they're released. The students upstairs. We'll hear them. We'll remember. The living students. The ones we've been drowning and silencing. They'll hear the voices of those who came before, and they'll understand that they're not alone. That resistance is possible. That their languages and cultures didn't die. They were just held underwater, waiting." The chamber was empty now, except for Thomas and Carver and the still water. The surface was calm again, reflecting nothing. "What happens to us?" Thomas asked. "I don't know, but I think our drowning is just beginning." Carver walked to the water's edge and stepped in. He did not sink. He walked on the surface as if it were solid ground, each step sending ripples outward. The water preserves everything, Mr. Whitmore. Our crimes, their resistance, the truth of what happened here. I'm going to make sure it stays preserved. I'm going to become part of the record, another voice trapped in the deep, testifying for eternity about what we did. Wait, Thomas started to say, but Carver had already descended below the surface, sinking slowly, until he disappeared into the dark water. For a moment, Thomas saw his pale face looking up, his mouth moving in what might have been prayer or confession. Then there was nothing but still water. Thomas stood alone in the cistern chamber, listening to the chaos above. The voices of the dead children were spreading through Hawthorne Academy, speaking to the living students, teaching them that silence was not survival, but surrender. He could hear shouting now, teachers crying out in confusion and fear, students responding in forbidden languages, the careful order of the institution collapsing like a house built on sand. He should go up. He should try to maintain some kind of control, to prevent violence, to protect the children from the teachers and themselves. But his legs would not move. He stared into the water where Carver had disappeared and wondered if he too should step in, should join the drowned in their eternal witness. He had failed in his mission. He had come to audit accounts and instead had been audited himself, measured and found wanting. He had tried to be silent, tried to forget, tried to become another instrument of the system. Only the water had refused to let him forget completely. A hand touched his shoulder. Thomas turned to find the girl from the dormitory, the 12-year-old who had pointed to the floor. She was soaking wet, as if she had just emerged from the cistern, but her eyes were clear and focused. "You have to go," she said in perfect English. "You have to tell them what happened here." "Who are you?" "My name is Awi. It means baby in my language, Navajo. They brought me here 3 years ago. They tried to drown my language, but it wouldn't die. None of them died. They're all still here, speaking in the water, and now we're speaking again in the air. But you have to go. You have to be the one who remembers. You're the only adult who resisted, the only one who tried to hold on to truth." I failed. I almost broke completely. Almost isn't the same as completely. The water showed you something, didn't it? It showed you that we're all still here, still speaking, still remembering. You have to take that knowledge back to the world. You have to tell them that Hawthorne Academy didn't succeed, that we survived, even in drowning. They won't believe me. Who would believe a story about voices trapped in water, about children who died but didn't die, about languages preserved in cisterns? They don't have to believe it. They just have to know it happened. Someone has to say the names. Someone has to count the dead. That's you, Mr. Whitmore. That's why you came here. Not to audit accounts, but to audit souls, to tally the cost of civilization. Thomas looked at her, at this child who spoke with the authority of someone much older, who had somehow retained her identity despite years of systematic erasure. "How do I leave? The building is locked. The teachers control everything." "Not anymore. The teachers are running. Some are trying to quiet the voices, but they can't. The dead are too loud. The building is in chaos. You can walk out the front door. No one will stop you. But you have to do it now, before the authorities come, before they lock everything down and bury the truth again." She was right. Thomas could hear it now, the sound of adults fleeing, of doors slamming, of horses being hitched to wagons. The careful order of Hawthorne Academy was dissolving like salt in water. He had a chance, perhaps his only chance, to escape and bear witness, but something held him back. What about the students, the living ones? We'll take care of them. The voices will teach them what the teachers tried to erase. They'll remember who they were before this place. Some will go home. Some will stay and transform this prison into something else, something better. But they don't need you. The world needs you. The world needs someone to say what happened here." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked one last time into the cistern where Carver had disappeared, then turned and walked toward the tunnels. Arwie followed him, her small hand guiding him through the labyrinth when he hesitated at branches. They emerged into the basement, climbed to the first floor, and walked through corridors echoing with voices in dozens of languages. Children stood in doorways, speaking hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, reclaiming words that had been beaten out of them, drowned out of them, carved out of their throats by years of systematic cruelty. The front doors stood open, dawn light spilled through them, illuminating floating dust motes like suspended souls. Thomas walked toward that light, each step feeling like a betrayal, like abandonment. He was leaving the children behind. He was saving himself while they remained in this place of horror. But Arwie was right. Someone had to tell the story. Someone had to remember. He stepped through the doors and into the courtyard. The flower beds were in disarray now, trampled by fleeing teachers. 3 wagons stood at the gate, teachers piling their possessions onto them, their faces pale with terror. They did not look at Thomas. They were too focused on escape, on putting distance between themselves and the voices that filled Hawthorne Academy like floodwater. Thomas walked past them, through the open gate, and onto the muddy road that led back to Guthrie. He did not look back. He walked through the morning, through the afternoon, his grey uniform growing dusty and torn. When he finally reached Guthrie as the sun was setting, he went directly to the office of the Territorial Marshal. Marshal James Hendricks was a practical man, a former Indian fighter turned lawman, not given to flights of fancy. He listened to Thomas's story with increasing skepticism, his expression hardening when Thomas described the cisterns, the drowned children, Carver's confession. "Mr. Whitmore," Hendricks said carefully when Thomas had finished, "you're describing events that sound more like fever dreams than reality. Children preserved in water, voices of the dead, a headmaster who walked into a cistern. Send men to investigate. Go to Hawthorne Academy and see for yourself. The evidence is there. The cisterns exist. The bodies are there. If even half of what you're saying is true, we're talking about the biggest scandal in the territory's history. Government-funded genocide, mass murder of children. Do you understand the implications?" "I understand perfectly. That's why I'm telling you. Someone has to know. Someone has to make a record." Hendricks studied him for a long moment. "You look like you've been through hell, Mr. Whitmore. When's the last time you ate, or slept in a real bed? Maybe you should rest first, get your thoughts in order." "I'm not confused or delirious. I know what I saw. I have a letter written by my own hand, documenting the first night's discoveries. It should still be in my room at the academy, if no one destroyed it. Go there, read it, then look into the cisterns." The marshal sighed and reached for a piece of paper. "I'll send deputies in the morning. If there's evidence of wrongdoing, we'll act on it. But Mr. Whitmore, I have to warn you, if you're mistaken about this, if you're bringing false accusations against a government institution, there will be consequences. And if I'm right, then God help us all." Thomas left the marshal's office and found a boarding house. He paid for a room with the last of his money and collapsed onto the bed, still wearing his grey uniform. Sleep came immediately, deep and dreamless, the first real rest he had experienced since arriving in Oklahoma Territory. He woke to pounding on his door. Sunlight streamed through the window, suggesting it was late morning or early afternoon. Thomas opened the door to find Marshal Hendricks standing there, his face ashen. "You need to come with me," the marshal said. "Now." They rode in a police wagon back to Hawthorne Academy. The building looked different in daylight, less menacing but somehow more desolate. The front doors still stood open. No smoke rose from the chimneys. The place had the abandoned quality of a tomb. "My deputies arrived at dawn," Hendricks said as they approached. "What they found—" "Jesus Christ, Whitmore, you didn't tell me half of it." They entered the building. It was silent now, the voices Thomas had heard the day before gone or hidden. Hendricks led him through corridors marked with muddy footprints, down to the basement, through the hidden door that someone had propped open with a chair. They descended into the tunnels, following marks painted on the walls by the deputies, down to the largest cistern chamber. The water had been partially drained. What remained revealed the horror that the darkness had concealed. Bodies lay at the bottom, dozens of small bodies in grey uniforms, their faces pale and bloated, their eyes open and accusing. Some looked recent, others had clearly been there for years, preserved by the cold water and something else, some quality of the cistern itself that prevented natural decay. "We've found 3 cisterns so far," Hendricks said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "All of them filled with bodies, children mostly, but also adults. We think some of them are former teachers or investigators who came here and never left. The territorial governor is on his way. This is going to be national news, Whitmore. International, what you've uncovered here. It's going to shake the foundations of the entire Indian education system." Thomas stared at the bodies and felt nothing. He had seen them alive in the water, seen them speaking and singing, seen them rise up to reclaim their voices. These shells of flesh were not them, not really. The true children, the ones who mattered, were the voices that had escaped, the languages that had survived drowning, the memories that could not be killed even by systematic torture. "What about the living students?" Thomas asked. "Gone. Every last one. When my deputies arrived, they found the building empty, except for the bodies in the cisterns. No students, no teachers, except for the ones fleeing yesterday. It's like 147 children just vanished into the prairie." "They didn't vanish. They went home. Or they're hiding, or they're beginning lives where they can speak their own languages without being drowned for it." Hendricks looked at him sharply. "You sound like you approve of them running away." "I do. This place was a prison. They escaped. That's what prisoners are supposed to do." Over the following weeks, Thomas gave testimony to territorial authorities, to federal investigators, to journalists who arrived from as far away as New York and San Francisco. He told his story again and again, describing the cisterns, the systematic drowning, Carver's confession. He showed them the letter he had written that first night, which had indeed been found in his room, documenting his initial discoveries. The nation reacted with horror and outrage. Hawthorne Academy became a symbol of everything wrong with the government's Indian education policies. Congressional hearings were called. Officials resigned or were fired. Reforms were promised, but Thomas noticed that the reforms focused on preventing physical abuse, not on addressing the fundamental premise that native languages and cultures needed to be erased. The system would continue, just with different methods, subtler drownings. He testified at trial when former Hawthorne teachers were prosecuted. Most received light sentences for what amounted to systematic murder of children. The judge explained that they had been following government policy, that their intentions had been educational, not malicious. The drowning had been a pedagogical tool that had gotten out of hand. Thomas tried to return to his life in Boston, resuming his position at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But the numbers no longer made sense to him. Every line item for a boarding school looked like an accounting entry for drowning. He was let go after 6 months, deemed traumatized and unable to maintain objectivity. He moved to a boarding house and began writing. He wrote about Hawthorne Academy, about the cisterns, about the children who had drowned speaking their mother tongues. No publisher would touch his manuscript. Too controversial, too disturbing. America wanted to believe Hawthorne Academy was an isolated incident, not evidence of systematic genocide. Thomas kept writing anyway. Years passed. He grew old, documenting atrocities the nation preferred to forget. He received occasional letters from former students, now adults, telling him they had not forgotten their languages, were teaching their children the words that had almost been drowned out of them. These letters sustained him. On a winter night in 1913, 21 years after his investigation, Thomas woke from a dream of drowning. He was 73 years old, his mind sharp, but his body failing. He walked to Boston Harbor and stood at the water's edge. The water was black and cold, pieces of ice floating like memories. He thought about the children who had died, speaking their truth, about Carver who had stepped into the cistern, about his own failures to change the system. And he thought about Awi, who had told him to remember, to tell the story, to bear witness. He had tried for 21 years, but the nation had not listened. Thomas looked into the harbor water and saw faces looking back. The children of Hawthorne Academy, still speaking, preserved in water that bore witness even when the living refused to listen. They called to him in languages he had never learned, but somehow understood. Your work is not finished. Someone must remember. Someone must tell. Generation after generation, someone must speak the truth, even when it is drowned out, even when no one wants to hear. That is the price of witness. That is the cost of freedom. Thomas stepped back from the water's edge. He walked back through the snow and sat at his desk. He lit his lamp and began to write again. He wrote through the night and into morning, producing a manuscript of 300 pages. He titled it The Drowning of Language, Testimony from Hawthorne Academy and the Genocide of Native American Culture. He knew no mainstream publisher would touch it, but somewhere, somehow, someone would read it. He bundled the manuscript and addressed it to the Massachusetts Historical Society with instructions that it be sealed for 50 years. 50 years might be enough time for the nation to be ready to confront what it had done. He lived to be 81, dying in his sleep in 1921, his last words a whisper in a language he had learned from the children in the water. His obituary mentioned his career at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, his investigation of a territorial school. It did not mention the cisterns or the drowned children. Those stories had been forgotten by everyone except survivors who carried them forward in secret. Hawthorne Academy was demolished in 1915. The cisterns were filled with concrete, the land sold to a rancher. No monument was erected. The only evidence remaining was a cemetery with rows of small headstones, marked only with numbers, not names. But the water remembered. The Canadian river that flowed past the site carried those memories downstream. Native peoples who lived along the river said it spoke sometimes in the voices of children, singing in languages no longer spoken, keeping alive words that had been systematically erased. And in Boston, Thomas Whitmore's manuscript waited in its sealed box, preserving the testimony of Hawthorne Academy, ensuring that someday someone would open it and read about the drowning, about the resistance, about the children who refused to be silenced, even in death. In 1971, exactly 50 years after Thomas Whitmore's death, Sarah Kennestu, a Navajo graduate student researching Native American education policy, discovered the sealed box in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. She opened it and found the manuscript. She read it in one sitting, tears streaming down her face as she recognized her own history documented by a white bureaucrat who had seen and refused to forget. Sarah photocopied the manuscript and began sharing it with Native communities, activists, and researchers. The story of Hawthorne Academy spread, connecting with similar stories from other boarding schools, creating a larger picture of systematic destruction that could no longer be ignored. By the 1980s, Native activists demanded acknowledgement and reparations for the boarding school system. Thomas Whitmore's manuscript became key evidence, proof that atrocities had been known, documented, and ignored. It forced a reckoning that was still ongoing, but at least beginning. In 1992, exactly 100 years after Thomas Whitmore's investigation, a delegation of native leaders traveled to Oklahoma. They went to the site where Hawthorne Academy had stood and held a ceremony, speaking in Choctaw and Cherokee and Creek and Navajo, reclaiming the land with their languages. They poured water on the ground where the cisterns had been, water from rivers and lakes across native lands. They spoke the names of children who had died, names that Thomas Whitmore had documented. And as they spoke, witnesses said the water on the ground began to shimmer and move, spreading outward in geometric patterns, as if alive, as if it remembered. Some said they heard voices in the water, children singing in languages that had been drowned but not killed. Whether literally true or metaphorically powerful, the ceremony marked a turning point. The drowning could not be undone. The children could not be brought back. The languages and cultures destroyed could not be fully restored. But the silence could be broken. The truth could be spoken. Again and again, until even those who preferred not to listen had to acknowledge that something terrible had happened. Thomas Whitmore would not live to see this reckoning, but his testimony helped make it possible. By refusing to forget, by documenting what he had seen, by preserving the record when no one wanted to read it, he created a bridge between the drowning and the remembering. Between silence and speech, the water preserved, paper preserved, memory preserved, and in the preservation, in the refusal to let truth be drowned completely, there was a kind of freedom, not freedom from trauma or the weight of history, but freedom to speak, to remember, to insist that the drowned had existed, had mattered, had not been silent even when silence was demanded. This is the story of Hawthorne Academy and the children who were drowned there for speaking their mother tongues. This is the story of a system designed to erase difference through violence. This is the story of resistance that survived even in the depths of cisterns, in the darkness of water, in the silence that was never quite complete. This is the story of witness, of testimony, of the refusal to forget. And this story is not finished. It continues in every native person who reclaims their language, who teaches their children the words their grandparents were forbidden to speak. It continues in every acknowledgement of the boarding school system's atrocities. It continues in the water that flows through Oklahoma and beyond, carrying voices that cannot be silenced. Because that is what Thomas Whitmore learned in the cisterns beneath Hawthorne Academy, that freedom is not given, it is taken. That silence is not peace, it is death. That the price of true liberty is eternal witness, the refusal to let atrocities be forgotten, the insistence that the drowned still speak and their voices still matter. This is that telling. This is that witness. This is the story preserved, waiting to be heard by those brave enough to acknowledge what their nation has done, by those who understand that freedom means nothing if it does not include the freedom to be different, to speak differently, to exist in the fullness of one's culture and language and identity. The water preserves, the testimony endures, the voices continue. That freedom is what the children of Hawthorne Academy died for, what Thomas Whitmore lived to document, what we inherit along with the responsibility to remember, to speak, to ensure that the silence is broken and the voices preserved in water and memory finally rise to the surface and are heard.